Hello and welcome to Palestine Studies TV. I'm your host, Omar Baddar, and today we're going to be speaking with Dr. Rashid Khalidi. He is the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He is also the author of the new book, Brokers of Deceit: How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East. First of all, you have a very busy day of talks, so thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. Yep. I think for most Palestine Studies TV viewers, it is fairly well understood that U.S. policy is biased towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that it's one-sided. But there are many who are under the impression that it is pretty much that U.S. policy is well-meaning and honest. They're seeking a two-state solution that is based on the 1967 borders, but they never have the political will to stand up to the Israel lobby to bring it about. You seem to be taking a slightly different take. You've described, the title of the book is Brokers of Deceit. In your opening chapter, you said dishonest brokers. What makes you think that this is not a genuine effort?
Well, I'm not necessarily calling into question the integrity of the people who are involved. What I'm saying is that they are using language which, whether they reflect on it or not, is fundamentally and profoundly dishonest. It all goes back to understandings of things like, I'm putting these things in scare quotes, autonomy and so forth, which in fact don't mean what they should mean. In other words, in American diplomatic and Israeli diplomatic parlance, self-determination, autonomy, a Palestinian state mean things so short of what anybody would really mean when they say statehood, independence, sovereignty, and self-determination, that we really are talking about dishonesty. I mean, there's a long section in the book where I go back to where I think this all started. It started with then Prime Minister Menachem Begin's ideas about Palestinian autonomy, which he generated really for two main reasons. One is he had a very clear ideology of a greater land of Israel, in which there is one people, the Jewish people, which has national rights, and no one else. And that people had a right to absolute and untrammeled sovereignty in that land. Everything else had to fit under that ceiling for him. And although there have been Israeli prime ministers who don't subscribe to that ideology, it has driven what has followed. Not only generally speaking, but in terms of the ideas for autonomy, so-called, which Begin crafted, and which both President Carter and President Sadat, both of whom know better, were more or less forced to accept at Camp David. Now, when you say forced to accept, the United States forced to accept, it wasn't forced to accept anything. But there was a much bigger prize in the 1970s. And this was winning Egypt away from the Soviet Union. That was the strategic objective of everything the United States was doing in that decade, whether under Secretary Kissinger or under Secretary Vance, whether under Presidents Nixon and Ford or under President Carter. And they won. I mean, the United States won the Cold War overall, but in the Middle East, the great victory was this mid-70s moving of Egypt from the Soviet column, as it were, to the American column. And so, for them, it was well worth putting enormous pressure on various Israeli prime ministers, which they did without the slightest compunction in order to achieve that strategic advantage. So what I'm arguing in the book is that on the Palestine issue, unfortunately, American policymakers, whatever they thought was best, and I show that several of them clearly thought other things might have been best at the beginning of their terms, ended up acceding to the Israeli view. And the Israeli view produced a very low ceiling for what was acceptable for the Palestinians.
Part of what you seem to be suggesting is that there was a strategic imperative in the case of Egypt. That's why the U.S. was much more aggressive in that process.
Right.
There are many today, like General David Petraeus and others, who are arguing that Israeli-Palestinian peace is a strategic imperative for the United States. What do you think is the disconnect here? Why isn't the U.S. taking this issue more seriously?
I think this is partly a long-term, short-term issue. In other words, it is clearly in the long-term interest of the United States to have a resolution of this conflict. And if you go back to President Carter or you go back to President Bush Sr., both, and I think also President Clinton and others, even perhaps Obama to a certain extent, they recognize that this would be in the long-term strategic interest of the United States. But I think the key thing here is long-term. Nobody in Washington thinks long-term. I mean, it's all the next election cycle, this year, next year. What can you do for me today? I once had the great pleasure of teaching briefly in Washington. And the worst thing to teach in Washington is history, because everything is presentist in Washington. All they care about is tomorrow or today. Next month, 6 years from now, last year, nobody cares. It is the most presentist place I have ever in my life, lived or experienced. And I think that is the problem with this issue. The Palestine question can be described as strategically important, though there's a huge effort to poo-poo that, saying nobody cares about Palestine in the Arab world, this is exaggerated. I mean, there's a multi-million-dollar industry that's been devoted over decades to proving that nobody cares about Palestine except a few demented Palestinians. But I think that every sane, stable, logical American strategic thinker, in the privacy of his or her own home, knows that it is important, but it's a long-term thing. Yeah. That's the first problem. The second problem is the United States can achieve enormously important strategic objectives in this region while at the same time catering to Israel and to its domestic lobby on this issue. Because most of the Arab countries, governed as they are by autocracies, are not under any real pressure from their domestic public opinion to do what most Arabs would like the United States to do, which is to be less biased and more even-handed, and to actually try and help resolve this, instead of, as American policy has done, systematically exacerbate and worsen the problem. That's what we do. That's what this country does. It has helped measurably to make this problem infinitely more intractable over several decades. And most Arab peoples would like it to do otherwise. But the governments of these countries simply do not put any energy into representing their people's wishes on this issue. They have other fish to fry, they're more concerned with other issues, and so there's no immediate strategic weight on the other side of the scale, whereas Israel has a strategic importance of some size. Many people would argue that that's diminished since the end of the Cold War. But what do you put on the other side of the scale for the kind of policymaker who only thinks about today and tomorrow? And I think that's the other problem.
Yeah, even more narrowly, probably for their re-election campaigns in terms of domestic politics, that's still
right.
The consideration is tilted. You knew President Obama before he became president, something that many have actually tried to use against him as well, for that matter, when he was running for president. What did you think of him back then, and is it similar to what you think of him today, having been president for 4 years?
Well, you know, when we lived in Chicago, we left in 2003, he was a state senator. He had not even declared for the U.S. Senate seat that he eventually won. And so he was not concerned with foreign policy. I mean, as far as I was able to check, the only foreign policy speech he ever gave before we left Chicago, and more or less, you know, our contact ended, was that speech on the Iraq War, where he said he was not against all wars, he was against stupid wars, or foolish wars. So, I mean, I can't say that I had a sense of him as a national politician, because he wasn't. And I can't say that I had any idea that this would be somebody who would either be forthrightly supportive of the Palestinians or would hew to the standard line laid down by AIPAC, which American politicians almost religiously follow. He was someone who was intelligent and worldly. I talk in the book about how unusual it is to have a president who's lived as much as he has abroad. We've had very few, actually. President Eisenhower, as a general, served abroad. We've had some, but not that many who have this kind of experience of the world, that family who live abroad. I mean, since the Founding Fathers, everybody who's not only born and brought up in the United States, but have lived presidents, have lived most of their lives in this country. Yeah. And their foreign experience is in some way limited. This president has a certain sense of the world, which is broader than many others, I think. However, having said that, he is a supremely competent politician, as is shown by winning election and re-election. Yeah. Election to the U.S. Senate, and then these two presidential campaigns. And he's an astute reader of the political terrain. And what I knew about him before, you know, we ceased to pretty much to see one another was that this was someone who was not terribly adventurous, was not really a radical, and would only go as far as he thought, you know, the political realities would accept. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid that's what he's done. And the political realities, I would argue, have been misread by most American politicians. They could push much further in the direction of even-handedness and lose absolutely nothing in terms of real support. Yeah. They would be howling from very powerful interests.
Yeah,
but
I'm sure in Congress and so on. But
well, I mean, Congress is another world. Yeah. Congress is a unreality zone. Mm-hmm. I mean, you live in a little bubble of unreality in Congress as far as these issues.
Yeah. So every American president has pretty much said the same thing when they've talked about Israel-Palestine. They adopt the Israeli narrative. They humanize the Israeli experience, essentially, and, you know, whatever Israeli victims, they talk about them in a very personal way.
Right.
But then they always throw that token, and we need a Palestinian state in a very casual fashion.
Well, since President Carter, or since those presidents, they've talked about a Palestinian homeland or a Palestinian state. Right.
But there was about a 5-minute period in President Obama's most recent speech to a young Israeli audience, students, in which he actually went in detail about the justice of the Palestinian cause and tried to humanize the Palestinian experience. Do you think that's significant, or was it just an attempt on his part to kind of throw a bone, given the fact that his trip seemed so one-sided and unhelpful that he felt that he needed to say something?
No, I actually think that this president has a certain sympathy for the Palestinians. And I don't think he's the only American policymaker to have had that sympathy. I think Secretary Baker had it. I think President Bush Sr. had it. I think President Carter certainly had it. Dr. Brzezinski, Secretary Vance. I mean, these are people who, to my way of thinking, and I argue this in the book, every single president except President George W. Bush, somewhere early in their term, has tried to somewhat shift American policy on this issue, and has been rebuffed. President Carter came in talking about the homeland, went to Camp David to try and do something. He couldn't do it. President Reagan and the Reagan plan put forward an interpretation of autonomy which was insufficient as far as the Palestinians were concerned, but which went much farther than Reagan was willing to go. Out of a realization on his part and on the part of Secretary Schultz that you could not have a settlement on the basis of Reagan's ideas. But that's what they ended up accepting. The same thing is true with President Bush Sr., the same thing was true with President Clinton, the same thing was true with President Obama. So I wouldn't suggest that these are leaders who didn't have some sympathy or understanding of the Palestinian side of things. But I think you put your finger on it by talking about the degree to which this president and all American politicians virtually adopt, unconsciously or consciously, most aspects of the Israeli narrative. I mean, the bulk of the president's speech in Jerusalem read to me like pages out of Exodus. It could have been written by Leon Uris. It could have been spouted by Paul Newman. Page after page of that book, frankly, I hear every time I hear an American politician talk. Anybody of my generation and 20 years, 25, 30 years young. And I think that is part of the problem. I mean, it's fine to say this is how Israelis see things, because that, in large measure is how a lot of Israelis see things. But that's not reality, any more than how the Palestinians see things is necessarily reality. I think how the Palestinians see things is a lot closer to reality as it happens, because they see both Israel and themselves, and Israelis don't see the Palestinians at all. But that's not the point. The point is, having adopted, as this president does, it's one of the points I argue in this book. You can go back and look at all of his speeches that relate to this issue, not just his speeches to AIPAC, some of his speeches to the UN General Assembly, and others.
For that matter, to the Palestinians. In this
including his Cairo speech. His Cairo speech has more about Israel, the connection to the Jewish people, and so on and so forth, than it has about the issues that the Cairo speech is supposedly famous for. I mean, read it, and you'll suddenly realize, he's teaching lessons about Israel to the Arabs. Much more than I think he's speaking to issues that were problems between the United States and the Arab world. And I think that goes back not just to political calculations or to this or that speechwriter. I mean, he apparently has speechwriters who are clearly very much in tune with that narrative. It has to do, I think, with an unconscious sense that that's the way to approach the Israelis, or conscious or unconscious. You've got to embrace them. You've got to give them love. Well, I think if people spent a little more time looking at the diplomatic documents which are now available. I mean, I have no access to classified material, but what's declassified shows that whether you give the Israelis love or you don't give them love, the people who've led Israel over many, many decades are as tough as nails. I mean, it's not like saying what they want to hear makes them do what you want. It has never worked in the past. There's no reason to believe that it will. But that seems to be the president's approach and the approach of most American leaders in the past.
You've said that the extent of the settlement expansion in the occupied territories has more or less made the two-state solution virtually impossible. This triggered two trends. On the one hand, many people have taken that as an alarm bell, that there's an urgency right now to push very hard to try to save the two-state solution. Others have begun looking at alternatives, one state, one democratic state, and so on. They're thinking that since this is not going to work, it's time to think of alternative ways to solve the conflict. Which of these two do you find yourself more leaning to?
Well, I think that the analysis is you've got to start from an analysis of where you are. What state are we in? And I think anybody who talks about a one-state or a two-state solution has to be very clear about where we're starting from and how you want to get to where you want to go. Someone who talks about two-state solution and who does not talk about how you reverse a dynamic that has been underway for over 40 years, and in particular since 1977 when Likud came into power, is not talking about reality. And if you're talking about a two-state solution, you're not talking about a state and a Bantustan. You're not talking about a state with sovereignty and control and another state that's lacking an army, control over its own borders, control over its population register, control over its water, control over its subterranean, doesn't have airspace. That's not two states. That's one state. And to talk any other way is dishonest and corrupt language, which is why I use the term brokers of deceit. You are not talking about a two-state solution. You're talking about a 1.5 state solution, 1.25, whatever it may be. And that point, to my way of thinking, goes back again to not just the settlement enterprise. The settlement enterprise is not just a bunch of people with kippahs going onto hilltops. The settlement enterprise is planning in Israeli ministries for 40-something years, which has led to the creation of a situation intended to make impossible the separation of the occupied territories from Israel. It was driven, certainly since Begin came into office, by a greater land of Israel ideology and by imperatives which were mostly implemented by Sharon in his capacity as agriculture minister and later as defense minister, in order to cut swaths of land, create swaths of land across the West Bank such that you can't have a West Bank-based state. The second thing is a conviction among Israelis that control over everything important relating to the Palestinians is absolutely vital to Israel's very existence. That Israel's security depends on their stepping on the Palestinians. They don't see themselves as doing that, but that's what they're doing. That the oppression of the Palestinians is a precondition for Israel being able to breathe. And Israeli security managers have unfortunately broadcast that view to the point that it's unconsciously accepted not just by Israelis but by everybody. Now, if you go and see the gatekeepers, you'll see that the people who have been running the Shabak, which runs the occupied territories and has for decades, don't believe this anymore. They see that this is bankrupt, that this is a failure, that this approach cannot work. Unfortunately, they've done their job all too well. They and their colleagues in the military and in other parts of the Israeli intelligence establishment and the Israeli political establishment. So you not only have an ongoing settlement enterprise, which has a fantastic dynamic behind it. It may not have the support of the majority of Israelis, but it has this bulldozer-like dynamism of money and planning and laws and people in key positions throughout the bureaucracy who further its aims. And secondly, you have this idea that you have to have the Palestinians by the throat for Israelis to breathe. Well, as long as those two things are in place, the idea of even talking about a two-state solution is ridiculous. It's to my way of thinking, a disgrace that people allow themselves to say two-state solution and not talk about how do you take the Israeli hand off the Palestinian throat. That's the situation. Change that state and tell me how you get to a state of Palestine, and I'll begin to take seriously people who talk about a two-state solution. On the other hand, people who talk about a one-state solution, I think, have to recognize that we have a one-state solution now. There is one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. That's what Begin wanted. That's what Begin has gotten. If you want one person who's had more impact, you can talk about Jabotinsky and the ideology that Begin represented so effectively. It's Menachem Begin. Yeah. He got what he wanted when he came into office in 1977, right after President Carter was inaugurated. And if you talk about a one-state solution, you have to explain to me how do we get from where we are now to this ideal that the one-state solution presumably represents, whether it's a democratic single state where Jews and Arabs live within one polity, or whether it's some other kind of setup whereby you have one sovereignty which is partitioned in some way between the two peoples. I don't know what. Yeah. But somebody has to come up with some arguments, not only about how this would look, but how you get from here to there. How do you change not just Israelis? That's the big challenge, obviously. How do you change American opinion? And how do you change Palestinian opinion? I mean, this is a people that has been denied self-determination since long before Israel was established. Yep. Every other Arab people was either able to achieve self-determination or was on the way to self-determination by the end of World War II. The Palestinians were denied it way back from the time of the Balfour Declaration. Palestinians are not even mentioned. Arabs are not even mentioned. The non-Jewish population is mentioned in the Balfour Declaration, the mandate for Palestine. So this is a people that has never been allowed to enjoy sovereignty in its own land. And what you have to explain to that people is that they're not going to have separate sovereignty within the context of one-state solution. A lot of people are attached to that. Yep. A lot of Palestinians are attached to that. So I think there are many tasks that are incumbent on anyone who talks about a one-state solution, some of which people are addressing, but many of which I think nobody wants to think about. How do you live with Israelis? Okay? I mean, one of the things that I find most unattractive about some advocates of one-state solutions is they don't seem to be able to tolerate the idea of having anything to do with Israelis. Now, wait a minute. You want not just to have you don't want just to avoid having two separate states. You want to live in one state with them? Can someone explain to me how that is going to happen? Which is not to say that, be normalized in love and peace with your oppressor. It's to say, how do you envisage moving from where we are today?
What is the strategy from getting to where we are today?
Precisely, and that's what I think is incumbent. I frankly don't think a two-state solution is possible anymore. Maybe it is, but I don't think it is. But how we get from this awful apartheid, worse than apartheid in my view, status quo of one state with only one state with real sovereignty and real control over everything, to a more equitable state, that, to my way of thinking, is a huge challenge.
One last question. There are many activists who are so fed up with the political standpoint, with exactly what you're talking about, is that there doesn't seem to be a way for two states or one state, and they don't want to deal with the political aspect of it. So they're doing a lot of grassroots advocacy. There's the BDS campaign, which I think anybody would agree has been important in raising awareness about what Palestinians live under in the occupation and so on. Do you think that could ultimately lead to any shift on the ground, or will it really, at the end of the day, take advocacy towards changing government policy towards Israel before any kind of real change can happen?
I think that, I argued this in an earlier book, I think that the Palestinians have been very poorly served by their political leadership over most of their modern history. And that it's civil society, or whatever you want to describe it as, where much that is the best in representing the Palestinians has come from. I mean, the Institute of Palestine Studies, frankly, is an example of that. It's not a governmental endeavor. It's an entirely private endeavor. And it's done a hell of a lot more to advance the cause of Palestine in an objective and scholarly way than everything that's been done by the Palestinian para-state, whether the PLO or the PA or any other body. We lack a national archive. We lack a national anything as Palestinians. And it's Palestinian civil society which has done much more in this and many other spheres. So I think that, frankly, given the disastrous nature of Palestinian politics in the present, it's understandable that people would focus on these kinds of efforts. And I frankly do think that they have been enormously effective. Not just BDS. BDS is the most salient, I think, of them, but efforts that are being made in Palestine to resist, or to develop forms of resistance which don't fall into a pattern which, in my view, is self-defeating and helps Israel. This is a society which sees itself as the ultimate victim in history. And obviously, a population under occupation, under international law, has the right to resist. So, and that can involve violence. I have no objection to that in principle. This is not any old colonial society. This is a particular kind of society. This is a particular polity of a particular people with a particular self-view, a particular historical narrative. And telling them they're wrong is not going to change that. That's the way they believe the world has been organized ever since the Romans, ever since, up through the Holocaust. As a result, I think it can be shown that the Palestinian employment of violence sometimes has been more effective than others. But insofar as it reinforces the sense of victimization, it just reinforces Israeli society. And I think the best example of that is the Second Intifada, which is one of the great defeats in modern Palestinian history, in my view. The First Intifada, by contrast, which was largely nonviolent and was a mass movement, was one of the few victories in Palestinian history, the entirety of Palestinian history, the whole 20th century. And I think that there are a lot of people in the occupied territories who are thinking along those lines, whether how you implement these things is the hard thing. Here I am, it's easy to be sitting in Washington or New York and to talk about this. But I think those and many other kinds of initiatives are the way to begin to get this thing off square one and move it in a positive direction. And that's true in this country as it is in Palestine or elsewhere. This is not going to happen soon or quickly. The political system in this country is completely frozen where Palestine is concerned. there's a consensus of idiocy within the Beltway, in particular. It's not as true elsewhere somehow, but in this city, in Washington, where we're sitting today, there are a few people who express rational views, but they are literally few and far between on this issue. And it's going to take a long time before you affect the political level. It's not saying one shouldn't try and affect it, but I think grassroots efforts in universities, in unions, in churches, in synagogues, within the Jewish community, within the Christian, within every community, secular, everything. That is where you have to start. And local politics is where you would then go, long before you're going to have an impact here in Washington.
And there are many who are internationalizing the conflict. They've given up on the U.S. You think that could also be one way to circumvent the fact that the U.S. is lagging behind?
I think you want to internationalize the conflict, you have to have, again, an analysis of the world. I don't see a counter-hegemon to the United States. I don't see a counter-hegemon or even a coalition of counter-hegemons, BRICS or anybody else, who has the will or the capacity or the interest in challenging the United States. If you were to ask me, do Europeans have a major self-interest in the Middle East, which they're not really representing in their policies? I'd say yes. So does India, so does China. These are the places that depend on Middle Eastern energy. But do I see those or powers or Russia or anybody else operating effectively to counter American monopolization of this issue? No, I do not in the foreseeable future. It could happen in 10 or 5 or 20 years, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. Moreover, and I think this is really important, I don't know that we should be thinking in terms of, getting a counterbalance to the United States in the short term. It already is the case that BDS in Europe has been, and other efforts in Europe have been so effective that you're changing public opinion there. Sooner or later, that's going to have an effect. I mean, what you have to see is a long-term struggle where Israel has created a model of levels of inequality and oppression of different categories of Palestinians, which in the long term is unsustainable in terms of obtaining support from democratic societies like the United States and Western Europe. And it is completely dependent on the United States and Western Europe in various respects, economically, in terms of technology, in terms of people moving. If Israelis couldn't go to Europe and the United States, if Israeli technology couldn't flow and the Israeli economy weren't integrated into our economy, Israel wouldn't be a sustainable endeavor. It's not just money, $3 billion a year, $115 billion since Israel was created. That's important. And to the extent to which Israel is seen as upholding this horrendous system of inequality, to that extent will that model be unsustainable in the long run. And that's not a matter of changing this politician or that parliament or getting another resolution in the United Nations, useful though all of that is. It's a long-term grassroots effort.
Much broader shift in discourse.
Where we're talking about a much easier door to push open than is the case in the United States.
Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. This was very interesting.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
That was Professor Rashid Khalidi, author of the new book, Brokers of Deceit. You can buy the book by visiting our website at palestine-studies.org. There you can also access never-before-seen documents of the Palestinian negotiations team by clicking on Papers of the Palestinian Delegation. Thank you very much for watching today's program.